Hey. Thanks so much for having me. Excuse me for talking in English. I'm happy to take questions in French. I should be able to follow them, but my French is somewhat rusty. This is a book with Eric Posner. He's a law professor at the University of Chicago. And the book is an attempt to really think about a lot of sort of fundamental policy and social issues. Eric is a lawyer. He's not sort of a idealistic, out there talking to people sort of guy. He's much more detailed policy analyst. But while I'll go into a little bit of some more detailed policy issues, the main thing I want to try to convey to you is a broader social vision that this book is developing. And to do that, I want to ask you, a bit in the spirit of science fiction, to suspend your practical considerations, your disbelief for a moment, and come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictive city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So Marketopia is defined by the fact that all the major private property, the houses and land, the airplanes and factories, the intellectual property, are continually up for competitive bidding. And anyone can at any moment take control of these assets by outbidding the current owner and can possess them as long as the new possessor satisfies two conditions. First, she has to pay the bid that she made every month into a common pool. Second, she has to stand ready to surrender that asset to anyone who comes along and outbids her in turn. And this principle in Marketopia, while it exempts things like pets or family heirlooms and so forth, shown up here, it applies to many things we would usually think of as being public decisions. Things like whether whether Marketopia will exit the market union, of which it's been a member for many years, where the parks in Marketopia will be located, who will govern Marketopia, except that regarding these decisions, rather than being sold to the single highest bidder, for each of them there will be many alternatives. People will submit bids on each of the alternatives, and whichever has the highest total bid will be selected. And the money that is raised in this process is continually returned to the citizens of Marketopia in an egalitarian fashion, either by using it to fund public goods or as a social dividend, much as in Norway and Alaska, the money that is raised from the public oil assets there are returned either through public goods or through checks that get mailed home in equal shares to every citizen every month. Okay, so when you hear about Marketopia, your first reaction is this is the most extreme form of a free market that you could ever imagine. You know, people say that the Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States, are free market economies. But if you actually think about it, most things are not actually up for competitive sale. While, of course, there are stocks and liquid markets or whatever, you think of all the companies out there that if you had some better use for them, it's not like there's some competitive price that you could just buy them out for. All the intellectual property that's held by patent trolls who could come in and stop you from innovating using those ideas. Most things are not actually available at some competitive price. They're owned by some large corporation, some government, some other bureaucratic form that stands in the way of open market exchange, of turning over assets to their best use, all those sorts of things. So that maybe is provocative. Maybe it makes you realize that we don't live in quite the free market economy that we might think we do. But at the same time, it probably doesn't immediately sound very appealing. It probably sounds to you like in that sort of a world, the wealthy would win all the auctions, would buy up everything, would dominate everyone else. It actually sounds maybe a bit dystopian. But then you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by the wealthy in that sentence? Wealthy is the adjective form of wealth. And what is wealth after all? It's land, it's businesses, it's factories, it's intellectual property. And in Marketopia, nobody owns any of those things. those things are all common property. Their value flows equally to all citizens, and every citizen has an equal absolute right to use those resources that she receives to contest for control of the assets. In that sense, Marketopia is a far more thoroughgoing implementation of the ideas of common ownership advocated by this 200-year-old guy than were the communist systems that he actually managed to inspire, which inevitably degenerated into a control by a bureaucratic elite that was far more iron than the capitalist oppressors that they claimed to replace. Whereas under Marketopia, by the very rules of the system, everyone has an equal share and an equal ownership and an equal right to contest for control of assets. In that sense, it achieves true common ownership. So that will strike many as a paradox, maybe in France from a different side than in the United States, but I think on both sides we were taught to think that socialism and free markets are the opposites. You know, socialists in France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, will never shut up about how terrible markets are. And on the other hand, there's nothing that American libertarians, right-wing, like to denounce more than socialism, right? And yet, the notion that to have a truly free and competitive market, you have to have common ownership of property, that private property is fundamentally inconsistent with free markets, was not just a possibility, but a fundamental dogma of the field of political economy in the late 19th century. And the leaders of that field, the people who gave birth to the modern field of economics, as well as sociology, as well as political science, the marginal revolutionaries, Léon Walras, who is actually French, and William Stanley Jevons, both of these were convinced that you couldn't have free markets and private property at the same time. So this idea was actually most closely associated with this guy here. Now, can someone who's not read the book tell me who this person is? Raise your hand if you recognize this guy when I put him up on the screen on the right here. Oh, not as many people. In the US, it's about 90% of people. So that's Adam Smith. How many people recognize the guy on the left there? Yeah, most people here, even more than in the US. But no one knows who this guy is. So this guy outsold these two guys by a factor of 3. He was the best-selling author in the English language other than the Bible for 30 years. He, relevant to France, was a primary political inspiration for Georges Clemenceau and the radicals in France. But he was also sort of stood in the same relationship to the Chinese Revolution against the Qin dynasty that Marx stood in relationship to the Russian Revolution against the Romanovs. And yet, obviously, his ideas have largely been forgotten to the public. But they were not entirely forgotten. They continued to develop within the field of economics into something that came to be known as mechanism design, especially developed by William Vickrey, who was a devoted follower of Henry George. And Vickrey thought that these ideas laid the basis for really solving some of the fundamental problems that were plaguing Western capitalism. Unfortunately, he was a very reclusive guy. In the book, we compare him to Master Yoda from Star Wars because he sort of was silly and didn't publish his work and talked in ways that most people didn't really understand and so forth. But when he won the Nobel Prize in 1995, he thought finally he had a platform to bring his ideas for fixing society to a broader public stage, and then he died 2 days later. So the goal of this book is largely to take that vision, revive it, make it practical, and show how it can address some of the large-scale failures in our present society. And the way we do that is through a series of 5 detailed policy proposals, which we hope together manifest a more practical and concrete version of this Marketopia style vision. So the first is an alternative to private property called the common ownership self-assessed tax. It's a wealth tax, but unlike most wealth taxes, the value of the assets would be assessed by the people who actually possess them. And they would pay a tax on that, but they'd have to stand ready to sell the asset at the price that they assessed. This tax, even under very conservative calculations, would raise about 20% of gross national income as revenue. It would therefore allow the elimination of all other taxes on capital, wealth, property, et cetera, while paying about 24,000 euros a year to a typical family of 4. Those are very conservative calculations. They completely ignore the effect that this is expected to have on economic growth. In the United States, calculations we've been doing recently suggest that this could increase the size of the economy by as much as 40%. And the reason is that it would allow for far more fluid reallocation of assets to their best uses. So let me give you an example of that. So let's consider the radio spectrum. So this is a visual representation of the United States radio spectrum, which is now primarily licensed to people who do over-the-air broadcasts of radio and television. Can you raise your hand if you've listened to an over-the-air broadcast of television in the last month? Over-the-air broadcast of radio? A few more people. Okay, how many people have used Wi-Fi or 4G internet over the last month? Okay, so as you can see, the use cases for the spectrum have been shifting significantly in our society, and yet most of the spectrum is still held by these legacy firms. Things like Q91.5, that's a radio station in the Philadelphia area in the United States. And this is a representation put out by the Federal Communications Commission and transformed by an artist friend of mine, Mary Ellen Carroll, of the radio spectrum in that region. So each chunk represents some part of the spectrum which is useful for over-the-air broadcasting, but in order to make available high-quality Wi-Fi services, you need a much bigger chunk. You need like a whole rectangular piece of this spectrum. And so right now, if you want to try to repurpose it and you want to try to buy some of these out, it's a total mess. There's like 15 different people on different bits. Each of them could hold you up in order to try to stop the project or to gain a larger share of the benefit. But under this system, the Q91.5 wouldn't be able to just quote whatever price it wanted. If it quoted a price of $20 million or then maybe changed it to $30 million, it would then have to pay a tax rate that was based on that price, the time average value of that price. So let's say for 6 months it had a price of 20 million, for 6 months it had a price of 30 million. So it would pay a 7% tax on that. And so therefore it would owe about $1,750,000 for holding onto the spectrum at that price. But the beauty of this from the perspective of an entrepreneur is not just that one person paying that tax, but rather that each of these bits of spectrum would have a going price on them that would appear in a public ledger. So then if you're a Verizon coming in and you want that big rectangular chunk of spectrum there, all you need to do is circle that on an app, and immediately will tell you the total price of $82.3 million that you have to pay to the current possessors of the spectrum in order to appropriate them. You would then have this rectangular chunk that you actually want to use for Wi-Fi that you could then package together and charge $1 billion for to protect it because you're going to make use of it. And this little pink bit left over here that you don't need, you can put on the market for a value of $5 million and let someone else take it off of you for a different use case. Okay, so that is a description of basically how this system would work. because of all the ways in which this would allow far more fluidly intellectual property, private companies, land, spectrum, all sorts of public assets to be reused, while at the same time effectively keeping them in the public domain to a large extent, this largely squares the debates over privatization versus public ownership, and at the same time allows a far more free market than is allowed by so-called privatization, which actually puts things in the hands of a small number of monopoly owners. So that's the first chapter of the book. The second chapter of the book proposes a new system of voting where rather than minorities having to rely on bureaucrats or on political bosses who make compromises to protect their interests from the tyranny of the majority, every minority group would have the ability to protect their own interests, because every citizen would be allocated an equal budget of vote credits that they could use to vote in favor of or against the referenda, candidates, parties, etc., that they most value or that most threaten their fundamental interests. Except that rather than allowing people to just allocate their votes however they want, there would be an increasing cost of putting more votes on one issue. As you put more votes on one issue, it would become increasingly expensive to have more votes on that issue. So the cost of the votes would be, in units of these vote credits that you'd get, would be the square of the number of votes that you buy, so that everyone buys votes in proportion to how important things are to them, rather than just loading everything onto the one issue that matters most to them. So I'll give you a visual representation of this that we built. So these are some controversial issues in the United States. The elimination of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. Let's say we're opposed to that. Limits on the NSA's ability to collect citizens' data without specific court authorization. Let's say we're in favor of that. We're really strongly in favor of that. So we're going to put a lot. Oh, wow. Now it's really going down fast, right? Whereas if you just put one against that, it's very cheap. So that's a visual representation of that quadratic function. Okay. This system is provably sort of the only, in some sense, efficient system for making collective decisions. Okay. Third, we propose a new system of migration that would aim that rather than at present, where most of the benefits of migration either accrue to the migrants themselves or to the wealthy employers who hire them, we would seek to share the benefits of migration throughout the population by imitating a system they have in Canada, where individuals are able to sponsor migrants and can make an agreement with the migrant for some potential compensation in exchange for the sponsorship, with the sponsor taking on partial responsibility for the success within the society of the migrant. This system would build massively greater support for migration by giving a real monetary and also social stake in the migration system to citizens, to ordinary citizens, workers in wealthy countries. It would therefore allow for massively greater migration to wealthy countries than occurs at present. Fourth, we argue that antitrust policy, what you guys call competition policy, is incredibly important for a market economy. You can't have markets without competition any more than you can have democracy in a one-party state. And yet we argue that antitrust hasn't really been tried. What do we mean by that? We think that about 90% of the market power that exists out there is completely ignored by existing antitrust enforcement. What do we mean? Well, antitrust enforces against the power that companies have over their consumers, but it does nothing about the power that they have over their workers. And anyone who's ever worked a job knows that a company has way more power over the people who work for it than over the people who buy their products. And yet antitrust never does anything about that. When ArcelorMittal merged, they worried about the fact that they might have to divest some of the factories that serve the European market in steel, but they didn't care at all about where those were located. So you ended up with regions in France that went to one company and regions in Germany that went to another, and therefore all the steel workers in those areas ended up with only a single employer that they had to choose between. Second, and this is more a problem in the United States than it is in France, at least as far as I know, but in the US, there are about 4 or 5 investment companies, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, that own about 25% of the whole corporate economy. These are 4 of the 5 largest investors in essentially every publicly traded company in the United States. And they have no incentive, as a result, to see these companies compete. Compete for consumers, compete for workers, compete in the political process. And there's increasing evidence that, in fact, that leads to increases in prices, reductions in wages, and the control over the political process in one of the most iron monopolies that's ever existed in capitalism, because it truly coordinates all of capital against the interests of workers. And again, antitrust has done nothing about this, even though there are very simple interventions that could address it. Finally, and maybe most relevantly to this audience, we argue that the data that all of us every day contribute to Facebook and Google and all these online AI and machine learning companies are the basis of the value that those companies are creating. And yet, none of us receives direct monetary compensation for this. We have sort of a feudal arrangement where they get all the marketable value of the things we create, and what we get is a bunch of free services, like the serfs of old could go and chop down wood in the forests of the Lord. It's a bit like if when movies came in, and in fact, I actually have an interesting story about this. So actually, when the film camera was first invented, Thomas Edison actually went around, he got a patent on the notion of just videotaping people on the street and selling that as films. And he pitched it as, oh, this is artificial actors. We don't need actors anymore because we have this camera, and the camera will replace all the actors. And of course, that was a business model where all the value is going to flow to the people who owned the patents and owned the cameras, and nothing would flow to the people who are actually starring in the films, right? Turns out that the actual origin of the current film industry is that French filmmakers, in order to get around Edison's patent, started doing what they called recorded stage acting. So what they would do is they would record people who were paid for the purpose of actually acting things out, and this was, basically a different model that didn't fall under the Edison patent, and created the modern industry, created the Screen Actors Guild, created the ability of you to actually become an actor and earn a livelihood that way, made far better movies in the end, and led to a much more equal distribution of the income, because it actually got paid out to the people who were starring in and creating the content rather than the people who just own the capital. And effectively, I think we're right now in the American model a la Edison within the digital economy. There's just all this stuff we're doing, and it's just being recorded, and it's being used to allegedly displace us from our jobs. But of course, the people who are producing all that stuff that's displacing us from jobs are ordinary workers who are being surveilled and whose data is being used to train those systems. So we believe that we need to organize a new data labor movement that will create what we call mediators of individual data, sort of like a modern day trade union that will be able to have enough scale to bargain effectively with the digital platforms for a fair share of the value being created, as well as for, say, over controversial issues like fake news or misinformation and the management of people's attention. Okay, so these are all pretty radical ideas. They are not things that we want to see adopted overnight. All of these ideas have incremental near-term applications, both within the commercial sector and governments. There are all sorts of applications within the Ethereum blockchain already going, using quadratic voting and the property idea. There are dozens of data labor union type organizations that are sprouting up. These antitrust ideas are being looked into by Commissioner Vestager, who's in charge of those things in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. However, we portray this much broader and bolder vision for a purpose, which is that we really think the current state of Western societies is extremely dangerous and is tending to lead us back to the position of the 1930s. Increasingly, the visions of the future are not defined by liberal thinkers in the broad sense of liberal, not by people who want to embrace markets and openness and change and globalization and so forth, but rather by reactionary populists, people like Steve Bannon. And the only political alternative we're being offered is basically returns to failed forms of state socialism like advocated by Jeremy Corbyn and people like this, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And the reactions that we're getting from popular culture aren't giving us much ammunition for an alternative. And at the same time, power is concentrating increasingly into a very small number of platforms that are being asked to adjudicate all these issues. People like Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, et cetera. But despite this dire situation, despite the fear that I think it creates, at least on my part, that we're headed back to large-scale social conflict, I think there's a lot of hope actually out there, and I think there are some social forces that are beginning to organize in opposition. Within the sphere of ideas, there's a wonderful philosopher at NYU, Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's trying to think about ways in which we can both have a liberal, open, non-authoritarian society, decentralized society, and yet allow people to build community and have senses of identity that are more fluid. Within technology, the blockchain movement, and especially the Ethereum movement, I think are increasingly offering us a vision of how to decentralize the control of technology more. And in the realm of sort of media and ideas, I don't know if anyone saw The Economist's manifesto about a month ago for their 175th anniversary, but it actually borrowed a lot of ideas from the book, and it really expressed a notion that we can be radical as liberals. We can be radical and address issues of inequality and really transform societies to deal with the problems that have built up within a framework of decentralization and liberalism. And I think that Commissioner Margrethe Vestager of the European Competition Authority is showing a path there and may well end up with your president's support being the next head of the European Commission. So I think that there are social forces gathering that desperately want to see this sort of a alternative world. What we just need to do is offer a vision of how it can work, of how we can actually solve these problems. And to do that, we've created an organization called RadicalxChange. So basically, I was touring around with this book for about 3 months in the spring, and when I came out of it, I realized that there had been huge amounts of, really billions of dollars in investment from both big companies and startups into thinking about ideas around the book, that there were activist groups forming, that there were artists doing projects. And so we put together this organization, and after only about a month, 2 months of existence, we have already 40 people volunteering 10 hours of their time a week to help us organize a conference and then eventually a broader movement. In March will be the conference. It's directed by Jeffrey Lee Ya, but we have a wonderful range of people involved in 4 different tracks. Ideas and research, where we're continuing to develop these ideas, and that's actually led not by an economist, but by a post-colonial theorist and historian of the Portuguese Empire, Ananya Chakravarty, to develop technologies around this area and coordinate the work on that. And that's led by Mamie Reingold, who's the chair of DevCon, the big Ethereum conference this year. To communicate these ideas more broadly and help people to understand them and to think through them and imagine with them, led by Jennifer Lynn Marone, an artist who does wonderful work on data slavery, and she incorporated herself and so forth. And to help organize people politically, and that's led by Mark Lutter, who's a charter city advocate. And we have people within that track representing Europe and Africa and South America and all different regions of the world. And I hope some of you will be inspired to build things around these ideas and to participate in the movement because I think we desperately need a vision that embraces technology and markets that can really address the problem, so we have something to say against the reactionary populists of the left and the right. Thank you.
So before we open up to questions from all of you guys, I get to ask some questions to Glen, and you have to listen to his answers, which is cool. So thanks a lot for the talk. It was great. I'm sure that all the questions will have will make a lot more sense now that you have a good idea of what the book is about. And before we actually dig into the content of the book, I have a sort of meta question. I heard you had a podcast with Eric Thornburg recently.
And Riva.
And Riva.
Yeah.
And Riva was actually doing most of the work on the podcast.
Yeah. But she claims she was a bit tipsy when she did it. So.
Okay, hence the enthusiasm. In that podcast, you mentioned that you're tired of the cynicism that you see in academia, and you have a great line where you say that sort of systematic, cynical criticism is the worst form of conservatism because all it does is preserve the status quo. And so I was wondering if you thought, and you also mentioned that that's maybe because some people consider economics to be finished, and I was wondering if you thought it was that, or if it was just the incentive structure in academia which leads to a form of conformity. And given that, how do we make economics less timid?
Yeah, so that's a problem in academia, but there's lots of problems in the entrepreneurial world as well. The truth is that each of these areas has its pathologies. I was recently in Silicon Valley a bit after I did that podcast, and I was really struck there by sort of the extreme self-serving naivete and the extreme sort of disregard of any form of human knowledge that's not derivable from like ultra-rationalistic, what my collaborator Jaron Lanier calls weenie supremacism, sort of like anything that doesn't perfectly correlate with your exam score in terms of human knowledge is sort of disregarded. So there are many failings of different things, and that's one reason why we really believe in tying these things together. And I think that is really what can solve the problem. I think when academics see the enthusiasm and the possibility of collaborating with entrepreneurs and the ambition there, they can be inspired to take the things that really have been developing very deeply within the academy for 50 years, mechanism design, and bring those to bear on things that otherwise would be like, honestly, quite haphazard, quote, mechanism designs, unquote, that are being used in things like the blockchain space, which are interesting and ambitious, but ultimately, like the amount of thought that's gone into actually designing them is pretty minimal, and they have lots of unintended consequences. And on the other hand, you know, the academics are super conservative if you don't draw them out. And on the other hand, if they're not tempered by how people actually experience these things and the arts, both of them can become too rationalistic and so forth. So it's only by creating a dialogue between these things and by what I would call true radicalism, which is by going deep into the ideas and really taking them seriously, you actually find that they're connected to other people. You know, I'm not an economic supremacist. I actually think that if you take economics really, really seriously, you find that its conclusions are similar to the conclusions you would get if you took sociology really, really seriously and didn't allow the economists to dismiss it.
Cool, and yeah, and I think your publishing recently is sort of becoming increasingly entrepreneurial. You've changed your rate of iteration. You seem like you're publishing a lot more. How do you think that we could sort of shift the incentives towards publishing more instead of sort of your quarterly or semestrial or yearly publication?
Well, in computer science, it's a little bit different. I think one aspect of what I'm doing is accelerating the rate, but that's again something that in computer science is more common. But I think maybe more important is that I'm really trying to speak outside of a narrowly economistic space. I'm trying to connect many different approaches, and I'm trying to think about robustness beyond ways that a pure formal proof can allow you to think about. And I think having those sorts of conversations and thoughts is something that's really missing, not just from economics, but from philosophy, which has many pathologies itself, from sociology, which has huge numbers of pathologies. So each of these fields has a lot of pathologies, and it's only by being open-minded and being willing to genuinely collaborate and take seriously the insights from the other place that we can get over that, I think.
Great, so I think we're going to go straight into the book now.
Please.
And I know that most of you have a lot of questions on the chapter on data, so I'll leave all of those to you. And I'll start with the first chapter, which I think got probably most attention, or quite a lot of attention.
Yeah.
So it's titled Property is Monopoly. And most of the criticism I read, and I was a bit surprised by this, but most of the criticism I read focuses on very practical applications of it. It's like, oh my God, people are going to be buying my house all the time and I'm never going to have a place to stay. And I struggle to understand how that was so much of an issue when, a lot of people rent their houses and they're subject to the exact same thing. The landlord can change the price and just choose to have another tenant.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is that criticism is one I hear all the time from people who grew up in the top 1%, and I hear almost never from like African Americans and people like, who are like ordinary citizens, because like the notion that stability is like a common feature of life is totally belied by the fact that there's a 25% annual eviction rate in a typical United States city. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was wondering what motivated, because like, people have this sort of like emotional reaction when you talk about their houses, but when you talk about hoarding things like domain names, people all of a sudden are a lot more open. Yeah. And I was wondering what the motivation was for starting with houses, and why you chose that framing instead of the sort of, obviously you speak about the spectrum, you speak about domain names. I was wondering why you didn't go through that approach.
Well, I in retrospect, I think that those would have been a better set of choices. I don't think I quite would have done something as narrow as spectrum or domain names. I probably would have talked about privately held companies and something like that, or the $1 million loan that Donald Trump received from his father, which turns out to have been worth $400 million at market valuations. But I think those things would have appealed more. What we were really trying to do when we wrote it, though I think mistakenly in the end, was trying to make it very concrete for people and vivid.
Right. It was too concrete.
Yeah, maybe too concrete and too vivid. Yeah.
Cool. So I was wondering on that thing, given that a lot of the there was a lot of noise around that chapter, and so I was wondering if you'd had any sort of constructive feedback on it that's changed your view since the book has been published.
Well, I think, to me, the most interesting issue in that chapter, which almost no one comments on, essentially no one has, is what do you do with the revenue? The revenue that's raised, we say, gets returned in some sort of social dividend, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the thing is, like, ultimately, we increasingly believe in the notion of, like, public goods, and who actually, like, at what level should that revenue be dispersed, and to whom, and under what principles, and so forth. And that's something that I've increasingly been trying to form a view about. But yeah, nobody has discussed that issue. Everyone's focused on this, like, hot button thing, which ultimately I think is just a fallacy. But
about the computational stuff, like finding what the price for everything is. Or
just the issue of like, oh, my house is my castle. What are you, doing taking it? So that stuff is just a reaction, but it's not actually. There's not much of an argument there. Whereas like this stuff about what should you do to the money, that's really an interesting and difficult question.
Topic for another book almost.
Yeah, well, Vitalik and I have continued to work on things related to that. So.
And then, another issue which got quite a lot of attention was the applications of quadratic voting. And Tyler Cohen has a post about it where he says that the democratic process is about more than just decision making, it's also about deciding how you incentivize education, essentially. And one of his concerns with quadratic voting is that people will focus very intensely on some subjects that are particularly dear to their hearts. And in the book, or in the initial post on quadratic voting, I forget which, you mentioned same-sex marriage, and I think a lot of the audience of your book and the audience here is very comfortable with the sort of consequences of people who care very intensely about same-sex marriage being brought to fruition. But then, he asked, well, what about if it was anti-abortion measures, and are we as comfortable with those sorts of situations? And I was wondering if you agree that the incentive structure of QV pushes people to the extremes a bit more, and sort of fails to drive moderation and conformity, as Tyler argues that the democratic process should.
Yeah, so I actually think the democratic process doesn't drive moderation and conformity, and that quadratic voting does, because it puts a cost on being extreme. So it doesn't want you to focus on those things. It wants you to sort of optimally allocate your attention. But in terms of education, I think the question is which led to more education and better education? The system of subsistence agriculture, where everyone had to do a little bit of everything around the household, or the modern system of division of labor, where people can focus on things that they're exceptionally good at? I think it's pretty indisputable that education was more encouraged by the system of division of labor. And I think it's the same thing regarding elections. I don't think there's any reason why we should think it's systematically different. I think Tyler's argument could just as easily be used to be an argument to prevent all trade, because then everyone will have to learn a little bit about fishing and a little bit about baking and a little bit about building their house and so forth, because there'll be no opportunity to specialize.
I mean, I guess what Tyler hasn't said this, I'm sort of guessing what he could potentially reply, is that in the case of the market, a lot of people's incentives are aligned in the sense that what they're trying to do is bring down cost. Whereas in the case of democracy, people have sort of an interest which is broader, and values can clash, and so it's not exactly the same level of knowledge specification. So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that I'm happy for people who are very focused on abortion to have a bigger say in the to the extent that I have finite amount of votes.
Well, so there's a question of say, and we can talk about that, but the question you raised was one of education and what people learn. And I think it does seem right that people who are more focused on the abortion issue on either side should become more educated than other people are about it, and that we should have potentially a set of people who sort of self-identify as experts on that issue, who can, without having some hierarchical authority appoint them as experts, choose to focus in that area and therefore choose to have more say on that issue. And I think when you don't do that, you actually dilute the interests, especially of less advantaged groups, because what ends up happening is that, like, among the wealthy, people can be educated about everything. Among poorer people, people only have the chance to be educated about one or two things because they've got a lot of other stuff going on. And you effectively dilute their views if you throw in, with the 10% of them that know about any given issue, 90% of people who are of the same social group but are basically just noise voters.
So once again, a sort of problem of the people who are speaking on causes that don't actually represent them, I guess.
Yeah.
And so on QV, what are like the coolest applications you've had so far?
Well, the most ambitious one is there's something called, well, broadly, there's a category of things within the blockchain where people are trying to use it for verification effectively. So, the 51% attack is the classic challenge for blockchain, and it's quite vulnerable to it because capital is held in such a concentrated way in our society, but people are much less concentrated. If you had a system that was closer to one person, one vote, but you don't quite want that either, it would be much harder to hack these systems. But you do want to acknowledge stake as well. So if you have some way to use this to actually do validation, it could lead to a much more robust crypto system, I think.
So sort of avoiding the plutocratic aspect of the more computers you have, the more voting power you have.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And then there's also a lot of activism work. So there's people building e-government platforms based on this, where you try to form platforms and have people sort of discussing political issues using this.
Okay. The next chapter is about immigration.
Yeah.
And I think that as well got a lot of attention. There were a couple articles that came before the book discussing the sort of individual sponsoring of visas and immigration authorizations. So there's the obvious intention is to allow people who usually don't get the upside of immigration to get some access to that upside. And in a way, it's just a form of income sharing, and it's great. Incentives are aligned. You want to help the immigrant you're sponsoring to get the best job possible, because the better job he has, the more money you get. And so the first question I have is why, and actually there's two things I want you to talk about. The first is you have a great article about how that's a great thing for global inequality. And I don't think that gets as mentioned in the book, but I'd really like you to talk about that. And the second is, why do you think that's much better than just having an auction program for visas?
Yeah. So according to this article, we estimated that you could eliminate about 1/5 of total global inequality and about 1/3 of the inequality across countries by allowing this sort of a program, which is about as much as the entire reduction of inequality in the world that's happened because of the rise of China
you have this great
caused.
You have this great line where you say that Qatar did more for global inequality than Norway did.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Because giving money is nowhere near as powerful as allowing people the chance to work in a wealthy country. There are 1/3 of the population of Senegal says that they'd be willing to take at least 1/2 chance of dying in order to make it to Europe. So, we shouldn't be confused about the system we live in today. There should be no dancing around it. We live in a global apartheid system that is enforced by systematic violence of wealthy countries against poor countries, and poor countries that they colonized and oppressed and exploited for centuries. We have to understand that that is the status quo against which everything else needs to be judged. And the reason why I think that this is superior to a system of pure auctions is that a pure auction system is not really a complete market system. It thins the market down to just being about money. But the market in employment is not just about money. People don't just take the highest paying job that they're offered. People look for workers who are a good match for them. And similarly, we need some mechanism for filtering who will be a good social and not just monetary match for migrating to wealthy countries. And giving the individuals some responsibility for that on the filtering side and some interaction with the migrant once they've arrived, I think will help break down problematic social attitudes that stand in the way of migration as well.
So agency costs are offset by the sort of mixing and like limitations on xenophobia that interacting with the people you're bringing into the country.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned that Canada had an application that was relatively similar.
Yeah, I mean, Canada essentially has this system, except that there are limits on the type of cases where you can bring someone in and get monetary compensation for that.
You can't?
You can. So you can bring them in for any form of care work, and you can bring in people who you don't get compensated for. So those are the two classes where you can do it. But in terms of the responsibilities and the regulations and so forth, it's basically exactly the same. So the only difference would be that we would expand the Canadian program to also allow you not just to have people who directly work for you on care work, but also might work for a company, but then have a slightly less intense relationship with you personally.
And have some degree of income sharing.
Well, yeah, but effectively that's what happens in care work.
Yeah.
Because they're getting cheap labor. Yeah.
Okay, and so are there any other aspects of income sharing programs that you're particularly interested in? So I think there's a big movement in the US right now on developer schools that are doing income sharing programs. Have you seen anything else in the space?
As a general matter, I'm a fan of trying to move towards more equity and less debt on the liability side of funding higher education, of funding many things. So I don't know about the developer schools, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah, Lambda School, I'll send you the stuff after. Cool. And that relates actually back to the plans that you have for home ownership and stuff, because I'm sure that the decreased price will lead to less debt and more equity as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And relating to the to the visa sponsorship program, I read in your discussion with Vitalik that he's a bit scared of the increased surveillance that would include, and he says you sort of have to value, I think he calls it the non-panopticon as an actual desideratum. And I was wondering if you'd included that in your thinking as well.
Well, I mean, increasingly, I've been thinking about that, but I don't think it's obvious that has to be primarily enforced by a, quote, state, unquote. There's lots of things that are enforced by communities. Some of the countries that have the most effective rule of law are like the Scandinavian countries, and there's very little presence of actually a police state there.
Self-regulation.
It's mostly done by communities. And if these migrants are really embedded in communities, I don't know that there's going to have to be a large coercive state. The large coercive state comes into play when there's a lot of social conflict. But if this generates social consensus around this,
So that's another upside of having individual sponsorships rather than
everyone
just
has
an
a
auction
stake,
program.
and that everyone will feel that a migrant who isn't playing by the rules is basically taking away their stake. And so there would be a lot of incentive for people to enforce the system themselves.
Right, so a lot of the sort of applications that you discuss in the book seem to be a bit top-down. So you have things on antitrust, you have things on immigration reform, you have things on essentially property rights, which is sort of the basis of we can do top-down. I was wondering, before you open questions to everyone here, what are some of the coolest bottom-up applications that you've seen of the five issues that you discuss in the book, and what sort of radical ideas you'd like to encourage entrepreneurs to pursue?
Well, so one of my favorite things is I recommend there's a nice piece by Simon de la Riviere, who is a big guy in the blockchain space, and he's been thinking a lot about applications of the property idea as well as voting in the arts space. So I think that's super interesting. In terms of things I'd love to see.
Can you
yeah,
the $1 Million art
yeah,
website,
yeah. So
can
like,
you talk about that?
does anyone know the $1 Million homepage? It's like it's a collaborative art website, but the problem is it's pretty fragmented. It sort of is a great representation of like the sort of chaos and lack of public goods that happens with capitalism. But if you had under a Harburger license, or this cost thing that I talked about, I think you could get much more interesting collaborative art being created, because there would be much more flexibility in the control over those pixels. I think that would be super interesting, striking visual demonstration of how much better it could work. In terms of what I'd like to see, I think one of the things I find most exciting is the notion of experiences that are very tangible to people, but that also have some commercial value. So for example, I'd love to see a Burning Man run on radical markets principles. I think that would be super cool. And in fact, something like that kind of already exists in Hungary. It's called Liska Land. The idea for the cost was independently invented by a Hungarian economist, Tibor Liska. And so they've been running this for 15 years. But I'd like to see a bigger scale version of that, incorporating more of the mechanisms. I'd love to see collaborative spaces like the family or something like that, trying out some of these regimes for the management of space. I'd love to see the use of it in commercial real estate developments. I'd love to see the use of quadratic voting as a way of rating products, like on Uber or Amazon, because I think it would deal with a lot of the crazy stuff that goes on with ratings, where everyone gives 5 stars or 0 stars, et cetera. So I think there's a huge number of super valuable commercial applications, even before we get to these bigger things. But the other thing I would say is that I don't agree with the characterization of the other ideas as top-down. It all depends on how you approach it. I don't think any of these ideas are something that someone could press a button and implement. You have to build understanding, you have to build activism, you have to build community around it for it to even be possible for a politician to do it. I don't think a politician could implement these things if they wanted to. So the truth is, it has to be bottom-up, and I hope it will be. I hope people like you all will experiment and organize and imagine in ways that make these things possible in the future.
Great, thanks a lot. So we're going to open up to questions from all of you guys. I'm sure there's a lot of things that you want to ask Glenn. And there we go. See?
I have a question that you probably answer in your book, and it's about the first chapter that you have around this radical market aspect. How do you deal about the problem that you often see in a liberal system, which is when you have competition, people have resources and can bid to it, and I'm not sure I understood how you take into account the fact that today people have very different resources, right? And also if you take the kind of a side question, if you take this broadband aspect that you talked about, when you repackage it in a bigger lot, let's say you won the lot and you repackage it in a very big one, it makes it, I guess, to me, from my understanding, more difficult to kind of challenge, because you need to have the resources to bid 1 billion in this case, because you repackaged a lot of them differently. So it'd be super interesting.
Yeah, so those are great questions. So first of all, the tax itself would almost immediately eliminate, especially in France, even more than in the United States, the primary source of inequality, which is differences in wealth. Income inequality, labor income inequality in France is actually quite low. Wealth inequality is the primary source of inequality. This would essentially nationalize 2/3 of national wealth and redistribute it equally as a social dividend. So the ability of organizations to dominate other people that way would largely dissipate. But second, in terms of repackaging, sure, if you put down $1 billion, you can happily pay $70 million a year to the commons and hold on to that asset if you so choose. And there might be some difficulty in contesting that unless there's another pool of capital of that size, though there are usually some reasonable number of pools of capital of that size. Plus, we also advocate mechanisms that would make it easier to form things like that in a more public good sort of a way. But paying $70 million a year to the commons is a pretty serious contribution. What this system does is it makes everyone compete in terms of sort of how much they can contribute to the common pool that then benefits everyone, which I think is the sort of competition we want to be promoting.
Should share the proceeds of, or at least some of the proceeds of monetizing the data of the user. They should share the proceeds with the users.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure it would be so hard to legislate, and also like technically I think it would be rather easy to implement.
Yeah.
I don't think we need blockchain.
Yeah.
But my question is not about that, it's about like this first principle.
Yeah.
I've not read the book, and I fail to understand what is the how you calculate this tax on self-assessed value, and I'm not sure how you address the issue that like the 1% or the 0.1% is able to engineer tax optimization schemes and are able to seclude themselves from the rest of the population and creating huge imbalance and huge danger.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the tax rate should be set based on the turnover rate of a given asset. So exactly how finely you divide asset classes is a complicated thing, but the basic way of setting the tax rate is actually quite simple. It's just, houses turn over something like once every 14 years, so something like a 7% tax rate is right. Intellectual property turns over maybe about once every 5 or 10 years, so you'd want something like a 10 to 20% tax rate, something of that general sort. So that's a relatively simple principle. And in terms of the enforcement, I think that's a huge advantage of this, because basically here, everyone in the society is deputized as an enforcer, and they have a self-interest in being an enforcer. Because if someone tries to dramatically undervalue their assets, then effectively someone can take it from them at a very low price. So rather than relying on the state to come after and audit people and whatever, you actually turn the whole society into potential enforcers of these rules, because they're just interested in buying up underpriced assets.
So yeah, I am a woman and I am from India, so definitely a minority. But my question is about a dissertation that I did about social structure within emerging countries and how the countries of the West basically exploit the markets in these smaller countries. Yeah. And of course, a lot of labor is being lost to automation. Automation which the Western countries are bringing home. So what happens, when these ideas of universal basic income kind of floating? What is the price Western countries should be paying to the countries that they're exploiting because of, as you pointed out correctly, exploitation through colonialism, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think my basic perspective is that, the earth is common property. The earth doesn't, and in fact, the idea that you would have closed borders or that some part of the world would be locked off to some set of people is a very recent provenance. It's really a outgrowth of this very, recent period, and then mostly in the 20th century, when suddenly some countries got so much richer than other countries, which basically wasn't true throughout the vast majority of history. So I think ultimately we need some vision where the common capital of the earth is commonly owned, and that, as areas grow richer, there's a natural process of sharing that with the places that created the conditions that made that all possible. India and China obviously are critical cultural inheritances that made Western development possible. The Islamic world is the basis of all the mathematics that or it's the foundation of so much of the mathematics that we now use. So there needs to be a greater openness and sharing of those resources, because it's actually what makes possible the innovation. Because if we are wasting the human capital of such a large portion of the Earth's population, we're not going to innovate. And also, there are strong historical reasons. But I think, honestly, the more that we can move past a private property view, which leads us to think about exactly who did what wrong in the past, and the more we can lead to a common property view, where things are actually geared around what is the best way to take advantage of all the resources the world has to offer, the less we'll be divided over stories about history, because we'll be able to recognize them as stories over history rather than about sources of current property and capital claims. So, yeah.
Any last questions? No, then I'll ask you to all join me in thanking Glen for coming and answering all your questions.
Famille.